Webinar series. My name is Louise Mamooney. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Community of Practice and host of the meeting today. And as host, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you are on today. I'm on Gadigal Wangal land of the Eora Nation, and wherever you may be joining us from, I'd like to acknowledge this as Aboriginal land and elders past, present and emerging, and issue a warm welcome to any Aboriginal people who may be joining us today. Paul Hart is our distinguished guest for today, and he is Professor of Public Administration at Utrecht University and Associate Dean of the Netherlands School of Public Administration in The Hague. Paul was also Professor of Political Science at the Australian National University for 5 years up until 2011 and still maintains a strong connection to Australia through the Australian New Zealand School of Government. He has also worked for the Dutch and Swedish governments in consultancy roles on crisis management and governance. Paul's research and teaching interests are political and public sector leadership, policy evaluation, accountability and crisis management. And he's author of many, many books and publications, Framing the Global Meltdown, The Crisis Rhetoric, Politics of Recession, The Real World of EU Accountability, How Power Changes Hands, Transition and Succession in Government, and Understanding Prime Ministerial Performance, which sounds an interesting one. I'll have to read up on that one. Just to name a few, as I said. So after working to better understand policy fiascos earlier in his research career, Paul is now turning his mind to policy success. And you might seek out some of his later publications on this topic, including a recent book, Great Policy Successes and Successful Public Policies, Lessons from Australia and New Zealand with Michael Mintram and Joanna Lutyens. And there are also some short pieces in the conversation if you want to seek those out. So earlier webinars for the Community of Practice have included a talk on policy failures from Peter Shergold, and Joanne Wilkie has also talked to us about working on policy in times of crisis, as well as a number of presenters who have shared their experiences, knowledge and strategies to help us avoid the pitfalls or stuffing up policy. But now it's time to give our full attention to this concept of policy success. What does it mean? How can we measure it? And how can we help achieve it? So Paul, thank you for getting up so early over there, and welcome to you. I'll hand over.
Thanks very much, Louisa. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to speak. Although I must confess it is a little bit daunting to speak after the likes of Peter Shergold, etc. Let me also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land that you are all meeting on today, elders past, present and emerging that may be among us. In Holland, we can't quite do these acknowledgement of country in quite the same way. For example, the country that I'm meeting on is reclaimed land. So, you know, it's been created by engineers in the latter part of the 19th century. So it's, you know, we are always supposed to be old Europe, etc. But actually I'm on quite new land that doesn't quite have that same tradition. Yes, it is exactly as Louisa has said. I have spent quite a bit of my research career thinking about and studying, if you like, the dark sides of government, spending probably the first 20 years or so more in the area of crisis management, but also very fascinated by the question of why do things go wrong and why do they go wrong so badly in countries, you know, with highly educated public services, normally, you know, relatively responsible politicians, strong institutions, etc. I was very much fascinated by this and wrote my PhD about the phenomenon of groupthink, which you may be familiar with, this idea that people in a group context can can become more obsessed with preserving the appearance of consensus and collegiality in the group and cohesion than with having what the Australians like to call robust discussions about the issues at hand. But somehow, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, I felt that it was time to actually lean in to this discourse, or lean the other way, I should say. There's so much, permanent criticism of almost everything governments do. And certainly when I was living in Australia, I was living through the GFC there, which was averted. Its impacts were largely averted by quite astute sort of overnight Keynesianism on the part of the Rudd government, as you may recall. Or you may not recall, because that was precisely the point. The GFC never quite happened in Australia because of good government policy. And what happens, a year later, the whole thing has been rebadged and we are bitching about pink bats, etc. I don't want to detract from the fact that that was, a particularly badly run program, which had some, pretty horrific consequences. But, what is the puzzle and what is the piece? It seemed to me that the puzzle was an enormous policy success. That was a nasty piece in the puzzle. Yet there's an asymmetry in attention. And so the objective of the current project that I'm involved with is to sort of do something to address that imbalance. Now, I want to demonstrate that imbalance to you and then spend most of my talk, if you like, developing a language of success for you and showing what that might look like, how we can talk about success in a non-propagandistic, non-naive way, a way that is, analytical, systematic, etc. And at the end of the talk, I will also share some preliminary findings of the research that we've been doing around what might be enabling factors, what might be drivers of successful policies. So I will share a bit of PowerPoint with you. What then tends to happen is that I can no longer see the chat. So I'm looking at Louise to notify me if anybody wants to come in on the conversation. I'm very happy for you to interrupt me at any time, ask questions, disagree with what I'm saying. So don't feel that you have to wait to the Q&A, but I will make sure we have at least 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. Yeah, so let's see if I can get this PowerPoint going. Yes. You should be. Are you seeing something, Louise?
Yes, we're seeing
a screen.
Yes, we're seeing a screen, but a lot of. Oh, yes, we can see your PowerPoint now. Yep.
Yeah. Behind the PowerPoint is Manly Beach, by the way, but it's my favorite spot on earth. Okay, so basically in this talk, these are the claims that I'm trying to make. There is value in, if you like, taking a walk on the bright side, perhaps at the risk of being called naive. I think there's value in doing that because we do it too little. And the reason we do it too little is because our institutions and our cultural practices in government and around government are much more attuned to spotting failure and, if you like, identifying failure, problematizing failure, and to some extent learning from it. But in contrast, learning from success is severely underdone in the public sector, particularly if you compare it to the business sector, where talk of success and big exclamation marks, etc., are the norm rather than the exception. And one of the reasons for this occurrence is not just the fact that politics has a game of government and opposition and free media, etc., etc. But I think also in a more fundamental way, we simply seem to lack appropriate language. And yes, we seem to also lack, if you like, incentives to explore success, to take time to do that and to learn. There are some incentives and there are some rituals. I'm thinking of, benchmarking exercises or OECD, paying a visit. Sometimes they really, glorify the practices of a country in a particular sector, which then, get publicized widely, etc. But it's not common. And so I'm going to report you on our efforts to provide all this. But if I begin with learning from failure, which Peter talked to you about, probably very energetically, knowing him, I'd say that, that's what we often do and what often happens. And the reason is because, the spotlight gets cast on incidents and crises and failures. You got your royal commissions, you got all these kind of mechanisms sort of exposing the whole narrative, which then creates obviously a reputational political momentum to do something and to be seen to be doing something, to do better. There might be an element of professional bureaucracies, short of having to wait for major fiascos, but have built-in routines to even pay a lot of attention to small errors. Certainly areas like civil aviation, but I think a lot of these kind of high technology environments have developed cultures where negative feedback is an institutionalized and culturally appropriate mechanism to keep failures small and to learn from them. So it is understandable that there is a lot of, at least a rhetoric, but also significant attempts to learn from failure. However, we also see, if you like, that has its limitations and perhaps even pathologies. So, blame avoidance, trumping, learning desires. So you do something that looks good and I hope the problem goes away and the media caravan moves on. Sometimes it's very dependent on sponsors. And if those sponsors move on, the learning effort stops. But I think in particular, if you look at, and there's emerging studies on how we learn from royal commissions, including a recent one by Michael Mintram, my co-author on one of these success volumes. There is this phenomenon of what I call shopping list learning. The Royal Commission gives you 175 recommendations. These tend to then be sort of grouped into bundles for which different parts of the bureaucracy form working groups, and they start ticking the box exercises. And somehow how these things hang together kind of get lost in the process. And there might be an element of cherry picking there as well. So if we sort of take this for what it is, a bundle of strengths but also limitations. If we apply that same logic to learning from success, from things that go well, what does the picture of pros and cons looks like? I think, and I noticed this, I've given endless talks about this around Europe mainly, but once you give people license to talk about things that they are professionally proud of, it is amazing what happens actually in terms of, if you like, energy levels. And people are almost astonished that people are interested in casting a spotlight on what is generally taken for granted. If you look at the kind of work, for example, that public service in Australia has done certainly in the early months of the pandemic, massive social programs were dreamed up, were implemented, rolled out, relatively flawlessly, almost overnight. And somehow, a lot of the attention goes to one or two holes in the quarantine network, so to speak. Secondly, learning from others, if you can overcome your, parochial pride that, it's impossible that those bloody Victorians can, invent anything that is worth looking at. Then they're learning from one another's successes, I think, is something that is easy to do and that is sometimes practiced. And as I said, you've got epistemic communities of like-minded professionals, like this community, for example, where sometimes there are existing venues and platforms for sharing, if you like, good practices. But there are also limits limitations, and I'm sure you're aware of those. This sort of over-enthusiastic rolling out once you've got one little pilot that has shown, you know, some positive results, without any sort of due attention to the context, whether we need to tweak things and so on and so forth. There's also a kind of fashion-driven learning, you know, whatever is hot gets copied, which is not a good idea. And there, you know, professional pride and rivalry can sometimes get in the way of adopting stuff that is invented by the other mob, so to speak. Let me just sort of make it a little bit more concrete for you. If I talk about policy successes, let's you know, illustrate some things that I think intuitively, without any analysis, most of us would agree, you know, have been good things. So here you've got a social program, basically conditional cash transfer program, that literally has lifted, demonstrably has lifted millions and millions of people above the poverty line. And you see the conditionality you see in the you know, the ticked boxes on the bottom right. You know, those are kind of reasonable conditions and reasonable sort of benefits. And yeah, the result has been astonishing. It's one of, you know, this was adopted in the era when Lula was president there in Brazil. Bolsonaro has worked very hard to destroy all this and hasn't been successful fully, because there's such a broad and deep coalition that has now sort of protected this program, particularly also below the federal level. That he's been able to pare it back, but not to roll it back entirely. And he looks like a one-term president to me at the moment. So maybe this program will survive his presidency. Here in education, you know, always Finland gets kind of wheeled out as a case where they've got both primary, but particularly also secondary school well sorted. You know, great stats about getting people onto university, high graduation rates, very healthy teacher-to-student ratios, and so on and so forth. So here in this picture, it is kind of contrasted with the performance in New York City. This was probably a sheet that was made for rhetorical purposes or political purposes in New York City. But it's a globally known example, you know, among the sort of Western countries. Finland's probably the one that really punches above its weight, without tiger mothers, without, you know, students spending 80 hours a week in getting these sort of super marks. It is a rounded education system. It's not just a performance machine around maths and science. Then here we have a picture that Paul Keating likes to carry around and talk about endlessly. But, you know, with some degree of justification, I would say. This is sort of the stat of Australia's GDP development across, what is it, 20-year time span or something. And what this shows, of course, is no recession. You know, you see the big blip downward during the financial crisis, so the last quarter of 2008. But very significantly, and mentioned earlier, there was no second quarter of negative growth. There was, in fact, very healthy growth in the first quarter of 2009. And Keating would argue, and many have, that this beautiful set of numbers, as he would express it, are the product of, you know, regulatory foresight, reform zeal, whatever you want to call it, you know, a mature macro and microeconomic policy. I'm not going to argue the case politically, but I think that you know, it is plausible. So, having given some idea of you know, what kind of cases we are looking at, let me take you through a potted intellectual history of this modest field, or my personal journey through this. As you can see on the left side, in the mid-90s, this was you know, that book sort of probably the hardest book I've ever written with Mark together. It was sort of a coming of age book by two young, ambitious academics. We spent 7 years on this book. It's only 140 pages or something, but we had to throw out a complete 300-page manuscript after showing it to a guy called Aaron Wildavsky. And Aaron Wildavsky was like the god of political science policy analysis globally. He was at Berkeley, and he came to Maastricht in the Netherlands for a year. And so we looked him up, we showed him our manuscript, and he took us on a little walk down sort of the old city center of Maastricht and proceeded to tell us basically ask us 3 or 4 questions that we hadn't thought of, and out went the manuscript. Anyway, that book was very much, the product of our fascination with how can big, rich, well-equipped governments get it so wrong. But as you can see, the tenor of the title starts to change. And Alan McConnell, a guy at Sydney Uni and a very old friend of mine from the crisis management field, Alan sort of took it upon himself in 2010, eventually it came out, to write, if you like, the mirror image book to the Bovens to Hart book. So he said, if they can provide language to study failure more systematically, surely I can flip that coin and do something for success. And so a lot of what we do now today builds on Alan's work. Now, all this stuff about success and failure is very, seemingly clear and stark. It's almost it invites very dichotomous judgments and grand pronouncements. But then when you start digging into cases, you go back in time, you look at the perspectives of different actors at different points in the story and so on, you look at different metrics, then you see a much more ambivalent picture. This building that you all know so well, began life as a bloody horrible policy disaster by any measure. I think the competition took place in 1957. It was supposed to be built by 61 at a budget of something like, 4 to 5 million or something. It ended up being opened, I think, in 73. So, 12 years after the scheduled opening date, and it ended up costing 102 million. So, a very hefty cost escalation. The New South Wales government at the time lost elections over it. Ministers had to go. The architect was fired. You know the story. So if we were to evaluate this big project, let's say somewhere in the 60s, let's say somewhere in the early 70s, we would say, terrible waste of money, effort, terrible loss of prestige for the government, So on a whole range of indicators, it didn't look good. And then, of course, as in many big infrastructure projects too, then the thing opens and nobody worries about the costs anymore because there's now the enjoyment, or there's now the ease of use. There's the cut down commuting time, et cetera, which changes people's vantage point and the sort of the set of criteria that they use. And only then it became possible to realize that quite a lot of this enormous cost of this building was financed not from the public purse but by lotteries and so on and so forth. So the criteria we apply shift over time, and the momentum of those criteria and the momentum of those judgments can shift over time. In the case of Sydney Opera House, it has shifted towards success. In other cases, it shifts maybe back and forth, loops back and forth. Certainly in the case I mentioned earlier of the response to the great financial crisis, I think it looped in Australia, predominantly in Australian politics, it looped from, well, that's, jolly well done, to, royal commissions, the opposition just pouncing on the school halls and the pink bats. Which changed, I think, the overall perception of this piece of public policy. So in other words, we've got to be pretty precise in the language we use, the criteria we use. And Mark Bovens and I had begun by making this particular distinction. We did it in the context of failure. Alan has taken it to the context of success. So making a distinction between programmatic evaluation, ends and means, effectiveness and efficiency, if you like. And then you get these kind of, traditional criteria that we're all familiar with that a typical auditing agency would apply, for example. But then there's this sort of much more difficult to grasp and much more volatile, perhaps, political dimension, which has to deal with reputation, popularity, the breadth and depth of it. Are there any electoral pluses emerging from being associated with a particular policy, etc., etc. And in the book that preceded Alan's book, we had already begun to think about this. And we suggested that there is not necessarily a symmetry between doing well in programmatic terms and enjoying the reputational benefits of it. So we don't live in a just world, as you all know, in which performance gets recognized. Having said that, we also live in in an opportunistic world in which failures do not always get called out. Sometimes, the results are not great, but the story is good, or nobody's looking. We've had, for example, if you take institutions like the judiciary, the court systems, if you would take a good cold look from a kind of client perspective on, the quality of processes there, the quality of communication, the intelligibility of judgments for a normal person. Those types of criteria, then I think you would see variable performance, let's put it this way. But in many countries, court performance is not to be criticized. We like the idea of rule of law, so we accept a lot of bullshit going on in the court system because the myth of, the independence and checks and balances, etc., is more important. So in other words, if you run a complex program, my proposition would be that over time, or depending on who you ask, this program, this case of yours, can go on a journey in this 2x2, so to speak. So reputation can change, and obviously we all hope that we end up in the box of complete success where we do well and are recognized for it. But it takes playing the game to do that, because it doesn't happen automatically in contrast, or by contrast, I would say. Now, what Alan did was adding to our work by saying, look, there's a third dimension that we have to take into account in deciding how successful, or whether we can call a particular initiative successful. And he added the process dimension, and he came up with these types of criteria that you see projected on the sheet. In my book, there is too much overlap here with some of the political criteria that were mentioned previously. But certainly this fourth bullet on, okay, is there an element of newness here? Is there an element of creativity in the way we orchestrate the policy process? But also, I think what has happened since Alan's book came out, that people started to rethink this a little bit and have landed more on issues such as, do people feel heard? So basically borrowing ideas from the world of deliberative democracy, and basically asking questions about, were all the voices heard? Or social design methodology and so on. Have we taken client perspectives? Have we taken user-centric views? Have we given voice to the voiceless? Is there a sense of procedural justice around the way we have organized the policy process? Now, ultimately, in our work, which came out, so these two books, a global book and a Australia-New Zealand focused book, both came out in 2019. And we added yet another dimension, which is a temporal dimension. So it's all very well to hit the mark in time t, But I think the more robust form of policy policy or program is, of course, a policy that can adapt to the times and that can that remains programmatically, politically, and processually successful over time. So that's what we added. And looking with this sort of set of criteria, we then land on a definition of policy success that I've projected at the bottom. So 30 years ago, people would sort of basically say, well, we have no idea what policy success is. You know, look at the definition above. It's something mystical or mythical or whatever. And we've tried to sort of nail it down. So, you know, demonstrably creates widely valued social outcomes, i.e. programmatic success, design, decision-making and delivery processes that enhance its problem-solving capacity, so if you like, the intelligence or the smartness, but also its political legitimacy, and sustains this performance for a considerable period of time, even in the face of changing circumstances, such as changes of government, MOGs, God knows what else the world throws at us. And all of this then kind of translates into a map, if you like, a heuristic assessment map, where we bring together basically Mark and my original categories, Alan's operationalization of them, and the add-on stuff that we produced in the last couple of years. And, you know, this is a lot to take in, so I'll just leave it here for 1 second. But basically, it tries to sort of operationalize these broad categories into more or less observable or discussable items. But as you can see, this is not a measurement map. Louise was referring to how can we measure success. I think if you agree that success or otherwise of a policy has to be about more than just a programmatic dimension, which often can be measured some way, but also includes these more elusive things like process and politics, legitimacy, then there, you know, there's quickly you then find there are limits to a measurement approach. Yes, you can try and measure, and Louise in her own work has also tried to do this, but it comes in the form of basically systematic argumentation rather than measurement in a kind of literal sense. What is in these books in terms of cases, just to again, you know, hopefully enthuse you. This is a very interesting case of a country escaping the so-called resource curves, where basically you become profligate in your economic and social policy settings just because you've got oil or gas or whatever. Holland certainly, and it has been known as the Dutch disease in the 1970s in particular, where you become over-reliant in your fiscal position on this one source. And what if demand dries up, or if the source dries up? And the Norwegians have shown remarkable self-discipline in allocating a very large part of tax income to a future fund for a post-oil future for the Norwegian economy, but also a Norway that will have undergone demographic change and so on and so forth. So even in periods where there was leanness or big demand for, you know, government cash essentially, or government programs, governments have held the door closed, and partly this is because they enshrined the policy in law. They had it administered in a kind of by kind of a corporatist arrangement rather than, you know, the party or parties in power. So it's a very interesting case of tying yourself to the mast politically for a long-term objective. This is a very interesting example of a policy success at the international level. So, you know, we have been able largely to plug the ozone hole through, you know, a process of, you know, extensive international negotiations, highly expert driven, highly research driven. But ultimately, you know, basically governments have to say to certain industrial interests, piss off. You know, that has happened. If you look at all the other sort of growth indicators in this period, you obviously see that the world has been through enormous, you know, further modernization, industrialization. Yet, you know, the types of industrial processes that cause the thinning of the ozone layer have largely been regulated against. It seems that the more recent data is a little bit more pessimistic. This is partly because sort of China is not fully compliant with the regime. The government says it is, but it's not necessarily the case. But overall, this is a, you know, a pretty remarkable achievement, and in a way an inspiration for you know, other attempts to mitigate climate change. This is the Netherlands, as you can see, you know, not a mountain in sight, lots of water, and with climate change we will have lots more water at the wrong times in the wrong places, and this in one of the most densely populated countries in the world. So the traditional solution was throw concrete at it, dikes, dikes, and dikes. But that's no longer possible. The only option we really have is to make space for water. And this is a remarkable program of adaptive water management or land management, land use management, which has, you know, created consensually agreed deals that particularly farmers, but also other land users, either move their businesses or agree for their land to be purposefully flooded to give space for the water in periods of extremely high water and be compensated for it, etc. So it's a very intelligent policy mix, you know, driven again in a highly depoliticized fashion, or I should say, it is still very political, but not party political. It's not run on a government versus opposition script, so to speak. It is run on a script. You have legitimate interests. We also have a larger public value proposition that we need to, how can we square those, etc. Then here's I think an Australian case, you know, a case of a crisis proving to be catalytic. A government, at the time, a fairly new government, you know, it was almost like a Nixon goes to China. Who would have thought that a John Howard-led government, you know, would have, you know, radical action on gun control as one of its first sort of actions in office? Not many, but, you know, it took a pretty bloody, literally bloody shooting to make Howard change his mind or take a stand. And, you know, that is one thing that is sort of a heroic crisis response. But it's very interesting, that little stat that you see there on the bottom right, which is shown around the world and is certainly shown in the United States a lot in recent decades, is just how consistent that effect has been. You know, the numbers came down and they've never gone up again significantly, at least not in the temporal space of this graph. Now, so on the left-hand side of this graph, you see all these cases that we included in a global volume. And this is just an indicator of how you can use familiar mechanisms like traffic light systems, how you can use that, you know, using our kind of evaluation criteria. I think it's more important to point to an aspect of McConnell's work that I really like, where he says, look, we need to give people language and intermediate positions on the kind of success, complete success or complete failure, this kind of dichotomous world. Because, you know, when you have 4 sets of criteria and you have a whole bunch of actors and perspectives, you're bound to have shades of gray in people's appreciation of certain programs. And I won't go into the details of this, but he sort of constructed these 3 intermediate categories, which give you as an evaluator a bit of flexibility. So, for example, a resilient success would be, in short, a case where programmatically you're doing pretty well, but politically the fight isn't necessarily completely over. So you still got to sort of keep politically very alert that the policy doesn't get wound back because some of the organized interests are still unhappy with it, for example. Whereas a precarious success is perhaps a success where there is some degree of programmatic achievement, but a lot of pushback on either process or simply political criticism of the program. Taking the case to Australia, these are the cases that are in this book. There's also about 7 or 8 Kiwi cases in there. And it's very interesting, and I'm interested to hear from you whether, if I'd asked you the question, okay, what cases intuitively, are worth looking at through this prism, this fourfold prism, whether you would have come up with these or with others, etc. It's quite clear that when I present some of those cases to international audiences, people are incredibly impressed by the HIV/AIDS response, for example. Although that I think I should qualify as a resilient rather than a complete success. It's proven hard to kind of sustain the momentum for a variety of reasons, but it was quite remarkable. Medicare, I think, is quite national competition policy is programmatically and politically very strong. Water markets we can debate. It was very interesting that this chapter was actually written by people who had a hand in this policy, and almost as the ink was drying up, I noticed there was quite a bit of turbulence about unintended consequences and backroom deals or whatever the case was. Anti-smoking, Australia is certainly at the forefront internationally, but really I should say that you could take almost any Western country these days and you have a pretty positive anti-smoking policy story. If you make the time horizon long enough, most countries have come a long way. The same goes for road safety, for example. So those are cases where apparently there's a lot of international policy transfer. So ultimately all these programs kind of look the same. So what do we know? And I'll conclude with that, with my eye on the clock. What have we found in terms of some of those drivers of success? Well, you shouldn't be too surprised to say that, quite often it's a matter of things coming together. Problems that become salient, the bureaucracy or other players that have good ideas for programs that may ameliorate them. You got people with certain entrepreneurial or consensus building, coalition building skills, and you've got a political situation that is fortunate. That's your day-to-day reality. What we found remarkable, however, is how in many cases evidence and effective and repeated and creative presentation and authoritative presentation of evidence can play a disciplining role on policy debates. Good public service craftsmanship turns up time and time again, particularly also in some of the Australian stories. But also this kind of, leadership, and I'm not just talking political leaders, I'm talking public service leaders or leaders in the community that just refuse to give up. But that are also pragmatic in building coalitions across the lines of predictability, let's say. What we did not find was one dominant pathway to success, and you wouldn't be surprised. So we have cases that are highly reactive, such as gun control. We have cases that are highly anticipatory, such as adaptive water management. We have cases of the big, bold, dramatic reform, but there's also cases of this kind of incremental building in the same overall strategic direction and then eventually reaping the benefits. So there's this case about Singapore healthcare, for example, where there's this kind of patience and this adding, this tinkering with a system that eventually produces a remarkable effect on the health of the population, particularly also, death in infancy and those sorts of key statistics. Stylistically, it's very interesting that when you get outside of the Anglo world, virtually all of the success cases we have are produced by a more consultative, let's take the politics out of this kind of style or bring the whole system in the room. If you look at the Anglo cases, so Oz, New Zealand, and I'm completing a book on Canada as we speak. You see a lot more top-down powering. So you see, changes of government, being very important drivers or blockers of certain policies. But even there, I would argue, you see an overrepresentation of, despite majoritarian politics, the particular policy process being run on a slightly more inclusive, consultative basis. In some, where have we gotten to? I think what we've gotten to producing, an argumentation map. We have, I think, moved towards a space where we can talk more systematically and intersubjectively, rather than just, in a kind of armchair or journalistic fashion about a big label such as success. We are at a very early stage of, more causal forms of analysis. There's immense pedagogical and psychological payoffs. When I go to rooms of public servants and make them work through success cases, or I get them to talk about their own successes, remarkable things happen. And if you're interested in learning more, we now have, or by next year, we will have 4 books and about 80 or so cases, all of which are out there for free. So let me end there, and let's turn it over to Louise and see what you want to discuss.
Yes, so we have now the opportunity to put some questions to Paul, or you might want to follow up on his suggestion earlier on that we also reflect on our own successes and learn from each other and are welcoming of acknowledging success. So happy for you to do that as well. If you have a question, I'll just ask you to pop it into the meeting chat, and then I'll ask you to come on and introduce yourself and ask your question. So we're just going to start with the first one. May as well do that. Peter McHugh, I think you have a question. Would you like to come on and say hello?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Paul. Thank you. Terrific presentation. From an allied health perspective, there's been lots of successes and lots of attempts to try to duplicate the successes from anti-smoking, and as you say, it's been very successful as a topic and replicated around the world. But those same components tried to replicate for other allied health policies haven't been so successful. And just any thoughts you might have?
Yeah. Look, I think I'd say there's probably the solution the answer cannot be, well, there's better or stronger science in the policy area than there is in other health areas. I think it's something to do with the drama of cancer, and cancer being so big in our society, and maybe fear of it. If I draw the comparison to HIV/AIDS, it's very interesting. If you look at the early history of that around the world, policies to fight it. Sorry, this is my Siri. Then basically the HIV/AIDS research community had to fight itself into the money pot, which was dominated by hearts, lungs, and cancer research. And it took dramatic imagery and celebrity victims of AIDS before, for example, in a place like the United States, some of that funding got redirected. So you had a lot more momentum. Now, I'm not sure whether you recognize this, Peter, but my intuitive answer would be there must have been something about the drama of, you know, smoking kills and look what it does to you, that hit a chord that some of these other community diseases can't quite in the same politically powerful way.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.
We have a question now that I'm going to ask on behalf of Meghana Ganesh. She asks about, given all this kind of thinking about policy success, how do we tip the influence and the debate back to being a more, I guess, a more balanced approach rather than focusing on so much the political dimension, which I think we feel often in New South Wales we end up talking about?
Yeah, and you know, this is Meghana, this is the kind of question I fear, because it goes right back to where we began in the presentation, which is, you know, this fundamental asymmetry in attention, you know, that gets directed to failures versus successes, which you know, says something about our political and our public institutions, but I think also says something about our mindset and our mentality, and mindsets and mentalities, you know, cultures of entitlement, an expectation of flawless performance on anything that gets funded by taxpayer dollars, a complete aversion to risk-taking, etc., while celebrating the risk-taking of corporations. It's very difficult to see, to identify a button that we can push for that to stop. My sense is that we would have to keep waging guerrilla warfare, and talk to, for example, parliaments, and then I'm referring not just to the politicians but also parliamentary staffs and so on. Talking to auditor general offices, talking to ombudsman and so on and so forth, and persuading them. So persuade the monitorial institutions that are very important in shaping, you know, what gets talked about and how it gets talked about. Persuading them that there is learning value and potential learning momentum to be gained from exploring, if you like, those bright sides. And, you know, there's no point in talking to the media about this, you know, good news is no news, you know, that's just what we know. But I think it might be useful to talk to all those monitorial institutions and to see if you can persuade them. Now, the other thing you can do, obviously, is to organize more of these kind of celebratory rituals, or organize mini versions of the OECD within the Australian Federation, sort of, you know, non-partisan sort of think tank that doesn't grind axes, but actually, you know, examines comparatively what goes well, what goes perhaps less well, but has this, epitomizes, if you like, this more balanced, non-judgmental approach. So I think there's something we can certainly do, and maybe to inspire you, we are in the last stages of negotiating a deal with the Netherlands School of Public Administration, which is like the Dutch NSW. With the Dutch Parliament, we are going to train the new cohort of MPs that have just been elected in. This is an absolutely unique event in Dutch political history, that you know, grubby academics get their hands on parliamentarians before they are, you know, normalized by the system into tribal behavior. So let's see. That's a little experiment. Hopefully that gives us a little bit more nuance. Can't hear you, Louise. Louise, your mic. Yeah.
Thank you. The questions are now coming thick and fast. So yeah, we've got 6 minutes, but I want to keep them flowing as much as we can. So Nanda Kumar, can you come on and ask your question?
Thank you, Louisa. Professor Hart, I have this question. I've been in Australia for 27 years. worked in policy. My question is, I have seen that there is a huge lag in the adoption of technology and the resultant innovations in the public policy space. And that has, to some extent, explains why some of the successes in other fields have not come out in Australia, which probably I was looking forward to in your presentation. While I enjoyed the presentation. I've seen the way it has been, you projected the issues and what needs to be done, but I feel technology and innovation should have been covered somewhere in your thing in the context of Australia when compared to other OECD countries. I don't want to relate any statistics. You may be aware of it. If you take anything there, you will see where Australia fares amongst the OECD nations. For example, physics, mathematics, I'm just giving you an example, or STEM, all those things that they're talking about now. And even when the US did it in 2001, 2002, we were nowhere, mate. Nowhere. Even only now in the last 5-6 years, they're talking about digitization. It takes 15 years to adopt.
Yeah.
So that part of it in Australia, in the international context, should also be projected. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Yeah.
Paul, do you have a comment on that?
What's that, Louise?
Would you like to comment on that perspective?
Yeah, look, I think that is entirely right, as far as I'm able to judge. I read The Lucky Country a long time ago, which sort of, talks about it on a kind of a culture of complacency, a mild Australian version of the resource curse. We're having it good already, why worry? That may be part of it. There may be, deeper factors in it. I do think that I would suspect that if you zoom in on the last 5 or the more recent decade, let's say the last decade, I wouldn't be surprised if we see signs of a little bit of catch-up behavior on the part of Australia. There seems to be a lot more science-friendly environment than when I was living there, for example. But, I'm not an expert in the area, so I have to be modest.
Claire is going to ask a question now.
Thanks. Hi, Paul. Yes, I was just wondering, would you have any insights on considering implementation methods for shaping successful policies? For instance, in New South Wales, we use the deliverability framework, for instance, in relation to Premier's priorities targets for social policy priorities.
Look, there's 2 answers. One is, I think it's a rough generalization, but I'd say there's no meaningful policy that doesn't have, conflict or tensions built into it, right? So the question is, when do you want to have those tensions and conflicts between stakeholders, etc.? My strong intuition over the years has become, rather than to paper over those tensions in the policy design process, or follow a 50% plus 1 kind of approach, we're going to force this through, and then taint the implementation process with continued tensions. I've become a big supporter of richer processes of policy design, where we can have this conflict in a way that is hopefully helpful, so that when we get to implementation, we have already broader ownership of the policy and perhaps of the compromises that have been made, which then improves the chances of a successful implementation. The second thing I would say is I would support any techniques of implementation that include rich and quick feedback loops, so the implementation process doesn't become a rollout, but an ongoing kind of learning. If that comes at the price of things being slightly more messy and less streamlined, I think it's an acceptable price to pay.
Great, thank you.
And Su Lei Xiao, can you ask your question, please? And this will be the last question, unfortunately, because we've run out of time before we wrap up.
Sure. This is about the impact of social media. It's got really good benefits of, quick agile ways of getting information, or sorry, but also at the same time the want to be popular, the want to quickly be responsive to some of these consultations may also kind of make policies a bit faster, but also not well considered. What are your views? What do you think how policy officers should deal with it? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. You know about slow cooking, right? Slow cuisine and so on, which was a response to fast food. And I think we need to have a version of that in public policy as well. So we've got to somehow find a way to keep, conducting real-time conversations in the world of social media. That's unavoidable. Silence, you lose the battle. But at the same time, there should be a difference between talking about public policy or engaging with stakeholders through social media and the rhythm of designing our actual policies. We cannot conflate these two. If we conflate these two, you get the kind of, the old saying, policy on the run is policy underdone. Politically, obviously, that real time pressure is very strong. So your professionalism should be about acknowledging that that is the case on the one hand, but finding creative ways of seducing your politicians to slow things down and to act on a more deliberative, a rhythm of proper deliberation rather than a rhythm of, emotional responses and reflexes.
Thank you, and that I think is good advice for us to take forward. And I'll pass on the seducing our politicians, but I understand the sentiment. So on behalf of the community of policy professionals, Paul, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today and sharing your immense knowledge and wisdom on policy and policy success. And also I'd like to thank our audience for your interest and enthusiasm on policy. I'd also like to thank Oscar Johnson for supporting this webinar, and we'll be back with a presentation on the 11th of May, a new webinar speaking with Sean Cummings from New South Wales Treasury, and that topic will be on Aboriginal economic wellbeing. So I hope you can join us then. Paul, thank you again. And we did have a question. If you could share your presentation, that would be fantastic for those who would like to take more time to absorb all the thinking there.
Absolutely, and I'll make sure you get it, Louise. And there were a couple of slides that I didn't show, including this last one. I'm not sure whether you can see it now, but this gives you the link to our website where you can find a wealth of stuff. But I'll make sure you get the presentation, yeah?
Great, thank you, and thanks everyone. Until next time, take care.